Well, hello. Welcome to Module 4. This week, we turn our attention to what we might see as a less aesthetic and more practical application of words journalism. I can remember being an undergraduate in an American's Lit survey class back in 1985 and being taught that electronic communication in the 19th century shaped the diction and syntax used in U.S. journalism, and that fiction in the U.S. was subsequently shaped by these changes because people got used to the way to reading things that were put in a short, direct way, such as, might have to happen if you were sending a story via telegraph from one city to another. Well, all that's true, but it's not the whole story of the connection between literature and journalism in the 19th century. Our big concern is how these two methods of storytelling coincide in purpose. Over and over, over these couple of weeks, I've mentioned how attached realism is to elevating morality. It may seem counterintuitive to us today, but journalism contemporary to the advent of realism had a similar motivation. We can see that impulse in the work of our primary authors this week, Jacob Riis and Upton Sinclair. In the work of each, we can see a genuine agenda aimed at progressive reform, some in absolutely practical ways, and some, less so, unless you think revolution is, entirely practical. So, we're going to be looking at that. But first, let's talk a minute about the pitfalls for this week. We're doing our first close reading analysis paper this module, and it's only 2 to 3 pages in length. So length should be easily attainable. In fact, the shortness of it may be more of an issue than if you were asked to scribble out twice as much. Composing short, significant, detail-filled papers is a skill in its own right. And for this exercise, it's particularly problematic because you're being asked to include observations about more than one author. If you think about it, it might seem a little much to be asked to tell me a bunch of meaningful stuff about two different authors when the length of it requires you to only devote, say, a little more than a page to each one. So here's what I'd like you to think about as you approach this. When you write a long research paper, there are going to be segments of it. Well, what I mean to say is the density of what you're doing is kind of ebbs and flows. There'll be parts that will be tightly packed with information and data and evidence, and then there'll be parts where you kind of let your reader think about what you're doing, and so you give them a little space. So the actual the patterns of it are going to vary as you go through. In the close reading analysis paper, what you should probably do is just think about making one of those absolutely concentrated parts that you would include into a research paper. Only the reading analysis is going to be just that. It's going to be one really dense piece of evidence. Because your space is so limited, rather than attempting a broad comparison, probably the most practical thing to do is to concentrate on a single commonality between your writers or a single disparity. That way, you can maximize the amount of data that you provide about this one thing, making a good, rounded, persuasive piece of writing where you allow room for sufficient evidence to make your one point. These kinds of assignments sometimes make students anxious because they seem to ask an awful lot, while at the same time tying your hands about what you can do. My advice is to treat it like a writing puzzle. And, like everything we do, try to at least, approach it with an attitude where you're getting some intellectual stimulation from the puzzle, if not having, absolute fun while doing it. If you do start to stress, let me know and we can talk about how to go about this. Now, this week I will have some additional observations on our primary authors and on the state of journalism in the 19th century, so you can look forward to those in my announcements. Meanwhile, I guess that's about it for now. I look forward to hearing from you if you care to talk with me. I look forward to working with you and reading your responses this week. So if you need anything, you know where I am.